Cave Story is hands down the best freeware game of all time, not to mention one of the best platformers. The entire project was developed by one guy, Daisuke Amaya, over the course of 5 years, and quite honestly, the lengthy production time shows when you play the game. Everything just feels so smooth and so refined. All the elements a game needs to be enjoyable just fit together so perfectly, from the movement to the music to the bosses, everything. Now before I start anything, let me point out that this video will have a ton of spoilers that will ruin the game if you haven't played it yet, so close out and go play it. It's free. Okay, so right off the bat, you're thrown into this cutscene that makes zero sense. The game doesn't mention anything about who you are or where you are or what's going on. Quite honestly, I believe this is a super strong way to present the game to the player. Have you ever been sitting in class and the teacher assigns an essay then starts going through all these stupid steps on how it should flow? Well, for those of you who actually listened, this is the game's hook. It's a general human trait to want to pursue knowledge in something unknown but present. In addition to the hook, this mysteriousness is also the setting up of what will eventually become a reoccurring theme throughout the entire game. So using this initial hook allows for the game to set up the base of the storyline without the game becoming too boring. There's nothing more annoying than a game taking 30 minutes of cutscenes and stupid sort of gameplay to tell the player what the game is about. So now, that original hook that kept you playing the game for more than 5 minutes is beginning to fade. So far, you were introduced to the main antagonist and his two henchmen, the blue-haired witch and a lunchbox. That's really all the more storyline you can produce from the hook. Any more and the player will just get bored and turn the game off. But before the player has a chance to reach that peak of boredom, the developer introduces more action for the player, the Egg Corridor. Now, as you may have picked up on, I've been hinting at two major things that the game has been focusing on, action and storyline. A fluctuating combination of each needs to be implemented throughout the game to ensure smooth gameplay. A handful of developers fail to do this correctly, which results in two things. First, the action in a game is linear, as in it's the same amount throughout the game, regardless of whether that amount is high or low. This will undoubtedly cause the player to lose interest in continuing, because now the more you advance, the more boring it seems to become. And second, the amount of storyline is either too high, making the game feel more like a movie, or too low, which gets rid of any depth of the game. You're just shooting things because why not? Cave Story presents action and storyline nearly perfectly throughout the entire game. You can actually see the fluctuation of both in every zone of the game, and specifically to help the pacing of the video, I'm going to break down each one of these zones. The Mimiga Village and the Egg Corridor. Well, I basically already explained this in the first bit, so we're going to skip this part. Grasstown. Next up after the Egg Corridor, you're told to go to Grasstown, or Bushlands if you're familiar with the English versions. Here you're introduced to harder enemies and a new gun, the Fireball. And you know, this is all cool and all, nothing too special about this sector, just some more action given to the player, enough to keep them from getting bored. After a bit more of shooting blobs and bats, the player runs into another storyline element that ups their interest. It's Kazuma, the green-haired dude from the very beginning of the game. Cool, you actually get to know who this guy is. See, now while you were having fun shooting some stuff, more of the storyline's base plate was constructed, and none of it felt forced. Back to the Mimiga Village. Alright, now Grasstown is done. Kind of mediocre, but was still pretty fun and had interesting story connections. The player has experienced enough of the game at this point where it's safe for the storyline to begin to develop some depth to it, and that's just what happens. As you return, Professor Booster tells you the main conflict of the game, the Doctor obtaining the red flowers and the impending doom on the inhabitants of the island. Now, it's not so much the content of what is told here that makes it so effective, but the delivery of it. The player just came back from a happy-go-lucky area with silly creatures and upbeat music to be told that everyone in the island is as good as dead. The game completely flips the mood on the player, which has to be one of the most successful immersion techniques a game can utilize. Using the player's emotions is really the only way to get a player immersed in this sort of game which lacks hyper-realistic graphics or RPG elements, and getting a player immersed is a must-have for a game to have a chance at being great. At this point, the game speeds up, both the amount of action the player is dealing with, as well as the storyline complexity. The Sand Zone. Next up is the Sand Zone. You continue through here with a slightly different mindset as before. Early in the game, you were maneuvering through obstacles and shooting enemies because it's fun and why not, but now you have the knowledge of why you're doing all of this, to stop the Doctor and not get killed with the rest of the island. From here on out, the game experience seems to hit the player with more feeling, if only a little bit. Okay, so anyways, you're warped to the Sand Zone where you meet Curly Brace, one of the most influential NPCs I've ever experienced, but we'll get into that later on in the video. After choosing to swap weapons with Curly Brace or not, you meet Jenka, and from then on out you're filled in with snippets of information about Balrog and Misery. However, the Doctor still seems to be a bit of a mystery. By the end of the level, you finally do get to meet the Doctor, who's accompanied by his two henchmen and Toroko, the Mimiga that was captured at the very beginning of the game. This is the first whoa moment in the game, if you don't include Toroko's kidnapping. The innocent little Toroko, who's portrayed as just a small, helpless girl, is forced into becoming one of the monsters Jenka previously told you about, which you then have to kill. It's tough. The game is basically having you kill a little girl. I mean, you don't really have a choice, nor is she literally a little girl, but still. After dealing with the whole scenario, you go to talk to King, but that doesn't help the situation at all. King dies as well, granting you his sword. What's happening here is another example of that emotional immersion that happened earlier in the game when talking to Professor Booster. The Labyrinth. Because the player was just hit with a big storyline update, an area that matches it with action is necessary to continue the flow of the game. The Labyrinth is this chunk of gameplay action, and is essentially another Grass Town. Comparing it to Grass Town, the Labyrinth even includes a semi-major storyline snippet at the end. In Grass Town, this snippet was meeting Kazuma and Booster, while in the Labyrinth it's Professor Booster's death. Personally, I think his death could have been embellished a little more, but I imagine it was kept low-key as to not disrupt the flow of the game. The Waterway. Alright, so Booster's dead and you have Curly Brace fighting alongside you. It's time to go shoot stuff. Now begins my favorite part of the game. After pushing some buttons and shooting some walls, you move up on the island's core chamber, where you then proceed to fight it. I found the fight to be pretty tough at first, like I imagine most people do. There are a few tricks you have to pick up on before being able to actually beat it. The fact that this boss is tough strings together an upcoming perfect execution of that video game immersion technique I mentioned a while back, the one about sudden moon changes, but this time amped up. Starting with the middle of the boss fight, the first strong mood that the player feels is either painful concentration, anger, irritation, or a combination of the three. Following that, the player then feels that triumphant and relieved emotion we're all so familiar with after defeating a tough boss. Then, only moments later, the room suddenly begins to fill with water. There is no cutscene, no prompt, nothing to inform the player if this is at all scripted. You don't know if you're just supposed to drown, or you might have missed something important that pointed out how to live. At this moment, your heart races. You just beat this tough boss after all that time, and there's no chance you're going back and doing all of that again. Now you're in a mood of panic and confusion. But that's okay, because after the screen goes black, it's clear that this is all just a planned event, and you immediately chill back down to that relieved state. But not even seconds later, you're given a vision of the room again. What you see in front of you is a passed out, presumably dead Curly Brace. It takes a second to process it, but once again your relaxed mood is brought to an abrupt halt as you're dealt a blow to the gut. You're suddenly stricken with sadness and shock at the fact that this total stranger sacrificed herself for you. It's pretty crazy. Alright, so let's break all of this down. In this sequence of events, the player's mood changes from anger and irritation to triumph and relief to panic and confusion, back to relief, and finally ending on sadness and shock. Out of all of the games I've played, this has to be one of the most powerful manipulation of emotions I've ever experienced, in a 2D 8-bit styled game no less. The developer recognizes how big this event is, and very strategically sorts out the next 10 minutes or so of the gameplay to be fairly calm, letting your emotions settle. During this time, you swim through those tunnels with the spikes and battle the fairly easy fish boss, eventually washing back up Amiga Village, where you then teleport to the Egg Corridor for a second time. The Egg Corridor, the Outer Wall, and the Plantation. Alright, so now you know what the game can do to you after that last huge scene. The following three main areas you're brought to, the Egg Corridor, the Outer Wall, and the Plantation, are all used as an extended build-up to the final scene of the game, the 3 consecutive bosses. Assuming you didn't end the game at Kazuma like an idiot, you make your way up the Outer Wall and follow the mini-quest line presented at the Plantation. These areas have relatively low action and clearly imply that the final fight with the Doctor will be approaching soon. This 3-stage build-up is perfectly placed within the game, right after the emotional typhoon of Curly Brace in the core, and right before the final bosses. This allowed players to develop a sort of determination for finishing the story, ultimately causing the boss fights to feel more intense and dramatic. The Throne Room. Finally, the final boss. This is it. There's not a whole lot to say about the last 3 bosses. It's a difficult challenge like all last bosses should be, and feels genuinely satisfactory when completed. How exciting the whole thing actually is really just determined by how the player experienced playing the whole game beforehand. Actually, to be honest, the fight itself seems kind of rushed or poorly planned. I mean, the whole thing about the red crystal demonizing the Doctor and turning him into a barrage of red petals just seems strange and out of place. And that's saying a lot coming from a game with flying ghost Snorlaxes. But alright, cool, awesome. So the delivery of action versus storyline was pretty spot on throughout the game. But in totality, all of that really only accounts for a fraction of the features needed to breed a masterpiece of a game. Everything I've gone over so far has really just been part of the presentational feature of the game. Now let's talk about the next feature, the challenge. Cave Story's main challenges are adaptations of classical platform shooter games like Mega Man or Metroid. The player has to rely on their precise platforming skills to maneuver between an onslaught of enemies and their projectiles. And like most other platforming games, as you progress through the game, an increase in gameplay difficulty is presented by generally more difficult individual enemies, with increased health, damage dealt, amount of projectiles fired, etc. As well as an increase in the number of enemies and obstacles the player has to deal with at any given moment. Now, what's different about the Cave Story style of platforming from the other games is a usage of gun leveling and the consequences of being hurt. The game focuses on a careful perfectionist route for continuing through a zone. The layout of enemies forces the player to stop and think quickly about what move will be the best. Rash decisions will cause the player to be hit, which then starts a chain reaction of consequences. Being hit by an enemy causes more than just one problem. There's the obvious and direct problem, you now have less life and are that much closer to death, and there is a more unique problem. When the player is hit, they lose experience on the gun they currently have equipped. In each difficult situation, there's generally a most effective weapon to use, and if you have any brains, you're going to be using said weapon. Well, if you're using the best possible weapon for the job, that means you currently have that weapon equipped, which then means if you get hit, the best weapon for coping with the current situation is now downgraded. With the most ideal route to success smudged, the current difficulty now increases. This added difficulty lingers until the player fixes their mistake by getting their gun back to max level. But guess what? Your gun isn't as strong anymore, which means even getting it back up to max level will be hard. You'll have to either use another weapon which might not be suitable for what you're doing, or you'll have to just improve your overall game mechanics. This whole challenge technique causes a difficulty loop that forces the player to be careful, or whatever it is you're trying to do is about to become a lot harder. This is especially noticeable in boss fights. Just look at the rocket launcher. At level 3, each shot does a total of 24 damage, while at level 2, each shot only does 15. That's a 38% decrease in damage, and since you're most likely going to be using the rocket launcher on the boss, they're now 38% more difficult to defeat, all because you got hit once or twice. Part 3. The game feel. The game feel in Cave Story is nearly perfect. In terms of firing weapons, the smoke that leaves each gun and the sound of a shot fired or shot hit is very satisfying and prevalent. The strength of each weapon is most often visually noticeable as well. For example, the huge smoke trail in the Nemesis, the amount of rockets unleashed in one shot on a rocket launcher, and the size of the laser in the spur. This lets the player feel how good each weapon is without the need of some monotonous prompt or stats menu, which is a real pain and can break game immersion. Enemy hit sounds are very audible as well, and will either flash when hurt or vaporize into a puff of smoke when killed. How noticeable the death of an enemy is extremely important in games like Cave Story, where quick reactions to a ton of other enemies and obstacles are required. You can't be focusing on whether or not the critter in front of you is actually dead while there are 100 other things shooting at you. The puff of smoke an enemy creates when dead is so much better than any other slow death animation most other games use. This way, the player doesn't have to glance across the screen to know for sure if something's dead or not. The peripherals can simply pick up the puff of smoke. Continuing on with the game feel, movement is also at a nice and controlled pace. It's not too slow that you get bored walking right, but it's also not too fast that you can't see what you're doing. The ability to hold down the jump button to modify how high you'll ascend is also very nice, and the gravity for jumping is low, which causes the jump to feel less like a normal jump and more like a glide. This feeling of gliding just all around makes movement feel smoother. However, one conflict with this can be brought up. The sheer number of enemies in some areas where your movements have to be so precise would make the low gravity frustrating. Now, this could be an argument, however, the player is offered items that dramatically affect mid-air movement before any of these cluttered areas are reached, items like Curly's machine gun and the 2 different boosters. These items add cool and fun new ways to navigate through the world, and as such causes the environment to change around, leading to movement always feeling new and exciting. Part 4. The option flexibility. The influence of this feature on games can go both ways. Some have virtually no option flexibility, like a typical bland game with a linear storyline, while other games such as Far Cry 3 or Skyrim completely thrive on it and base their entire game around it. A good game has to have at least some flexibility with how the player is allowed to beat the game. Cave Story has an interesting approach to this concept. On the first playthrough, the game will feel fairly linear, as in you'll just constantly move from point A to point B. Now, this is pretty much how the game flows, however, through subtle hints strewn about the game or a quick Google search, you can learn that there are quite a handful of decisions you can make which in turn change the ending of the game. For me personally, learning about the best ending of this game was such a major uplifting, because I always felt this emptiness after beating the game, like that wasn't how it should have ended. Just the fact that you can get an even cooler ending to a game with an already great storyline improved my personal rating of Cave Story a substantial amount. Besides the 3 different endings and the choices you can make between trading guns, Cave Story really doesn't offer a huge set of flexible options. Keep in mind the options they did include were great, but overall I think this is the weakest feature of the entire game. Part 5. Arts. Last but not least are the arts, how the game is presented to the player from an artistic standpoint. The overall style of the game is supposed to imitate an early Nintendo or Super Nintendo game. The pixelated graphics and chiptune-like music can be a fairly personal taste, but in my opinion were created very well. The color set for each zone, however, seems slightly bland. What the developer did is create zone-specific color schemes, which is a good approach, however not a whole lot ever really seemed to pop out. The music, on the other hand, was extraordinary. Not only were the songs themselves well composed and catchy, but the mood each song presented to the player was perfectly placed throughout the game. The happy, carefree music in Grasstown before any real plot had developed, the slow, emotional, sad song that plays in the waterways after Curly Brace dies, or the use of the main theme in the plantation right before the player is about to face the game's last big challenge. They're all so perfectly aligned with the story. Overall, Cave Story had some of the most memorable video game music of anything I have ever played. Well, there you have it. This was my first video game breakdown. If you'd like to see me make more of these videos, comment with any games you'd like to see broken down and I might just do it. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'm out.